Kia ora mai tātou. Whakataka tahau ki te uru, whakataka tahau ki te tonga. Kia makinakina ki uta, kia mataratara ki tai. E hi ake ana te atakura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu. Tihei mauri ora. Good morning, councillors, members of the public and council staff. Welcome to the council meeting of the 31st of October 2018. Just want to remind everybody that this meeting is being live streamed. It's bound to be of great interest, and we may even end up breaking the internet. Voting today will be done through our electronic voting system, with which you're all familiar now. I don't have any apologies for anybody, no early departures either. There aren't any announcements to be made, nor do I have any conflict of interest declarations made to me prior. Anybody want to declare a conflict of interest? Upcoming papers? No? We'll move to the confirmation of minutes. I move that we approve the minutes of the council meeting held on the 26th of September 2018, having been circulated, taken as read and confirmed as an accurate record of that meeting. I'm happy to move. Councillor Gilbert to second. All those in favour, please push 1. We're away. We're racing. That is carried. Thank you. We'll now move to report. There's no public participation today, so we'll move to report 2.1 on page 7. Councillor Foster.
Thanks, Justin. This is a rats and mice district plan change, which has nothing to do with predator-free, but these are relatively minor changes. Sometimes it's things that we own and we want to rezone them. There are a couple that I wanted to draw your attention to. Obviously, they've all been through the hearings process, the submission process, any hearings process and any appeals, and there were none in that category. The two ones that I wanted to particularly alert you to, terrace gardens. They're very nice to see the Flagstaff Hill Park becoming open space, or open space A. 6 Campbell Street below that, so that's the piece of land that was a residential property, an older residential property, and not the greatest of condition that we purchased. That has been rezoned and effectively added to the St John site, so we have a bigger parcel there for being able to sell as part of the Karori Town Centre redevelopment. You'll see there's some discussion later on in the papers about Pepper Tree Lane and some zoning there. And there were quite some discussions around the Hawker Street one with some of the neighbours about the concerns about the potential for development that might occur with that site following the rezoning, the land swap and rezoning. So we did the land swap, then the rezoning. Officers have advised me that those concerns of the neighbours have been assuaged and that they are confident of relying on the district plan and the various restraints that the district plan has put on that site. So it's my pleasure to move.
Councillor Foster, you have a seconder. Councillor Gilbert, you wish to speak? Councillor Panup.
Very briefly, again, lovely to see Flagstaff Hill being protected for future generations. Councillor Foster, I'm somewhat surprised by your point around Oriental Terrace. If that's correct, that the neighbours are happy, that's fine. But generally I find that Wellington public is somewhat sceptical if it means having to rely on the district plan to control development. So we shall see, and let's hope it is appropriate.
No more debate. Councillor Foster, right of reply. Thank you. The report has been moved and seconded. All those in favour, please push 1. That's unanimous. The recommendations are carried. Thank you, councillors. We'll now move to item 2.2, the Local Government Funding Agency AGM shareholder voting. I'm pleased to introduce this report. Just a couple of points. For those that aren't aware, the Local Government Funding Agency was established by participating councils in order to give us a reliable funding stream and grouping councils together. We have 56 council members and loans approximately of $8 billion in total. It's been working well and is a good tool for funding requirements of councils. A couple of points will be discussed at the AGM, which will be held here in Wellington and will be ably represented by Martin Reid, so thank you, Martin, for doing that. in particular around the appointment or reappointment of a non-independent and independent director, and also around CCOs, giving them the flexibility to utilise and access local government funding authority funding mechanism. That will, of course, require the approval of the authorising council, so in many respects no change for us, but it would streamline the process and make it easier for CCOs around the country to access, permissible to access LGFA funding. One point I did want to notice is in paragraph 4 here, it talks about the LGFA having built a successful track record and talking about continuous improvement and evolution. And on that basis, it would be good to see a better representation of ethnic and gender diversity around that table, which seems fairly homogenous at this point in time. And as we can see from the representation around this table, we benefit as a city by having a greater diversity and representation. And I think to that end, Councillor Fitzsimons may well have an amendment. I'm happy to move. Councillor Smarsh, happy to second. You wish to speak?
Only very briefly, thanks, Your Worship. Echoing your comments that this has become a very useful tool, the LGFA, for councils and our ability to access funding. Again, reiterating the points, those of you who are a little bit concerned that this may mean that CCOs can go and borrow money, it doesn't happen quite that simply. Council, in our case, we would have to approve it. We also need to have the capacity to lend that amount of money if necessary, that we had to guarantee that loan. So I think this is a good change, and I look forward to Councillor Fitzsimons, where have you gone, your amendment.
Councillor Fitzsimons.
Yes, I'd like to move an amendment that we agree to request the Local Government Funding Agency to improve its gender and ethnic diversity among its directors. I think it's particularly important that public institutions, like the ones that make up this agency, and including the Wellington City Council, lead the way in ensuring that boards reflect the diversity of our population, because that is the way that we ensure their legitimacy. And I'm very confident that there are a number of women and people from non-white backgrounds who could participate in this organisation and make a very, very useful contribution. I just want to be clear that this is no way a reflection of the competence of the current directors. It's just a reality of living in 2018, that we make sure that we do reflect the diversity of the community to ensure that legitimacy and better decision making.
And you've got a seconder? Deputy Mayor Day, you wish to speak? Anyone else wish to speak? Councillor Gilbert.
Yeah, Your Worship, I fully support this. I think it's very appropriate to have a better gender balance and ethnic balance.
Councillor Free.
So I'm not quite sure how to do this, but I'd like to move some sort of amendment that would mean that in relation to agenda item 6 on page 12, there are actually two things that we're being asked to approve as changes to the foundation policies, and I think that they actually...
Councillor Free, we're speaking to the amendment.
Oh, sorry.
If you want to speak
Right.
to the substantive, do you wish to speak later?
Yes,
Okay.
I will speak to the substantive now then, or perhaps...
No, amendment now?
No, I've
Do you want
got nothing to say to the
okay.
amendment. I support the
We'll
amendment.
vote on the amendment and we'll move back to the substantive. Thank you. Councillor Foster.
Look, I think this is entirely appropriate as an amendment. The one thing I would say is that it's probably better to say to seek to improve the gender and ethnic diversity is kind of a direction to do it. The first key thing there needs to be that people, whoever they may be, are capable, competent to do it. Now, often what happens, and I think in many of our boards, is that if you're in the group, you're in the group. If you're not in the group, it's blooming hard to get into the group. And so the opportunity of giving people an opportunity is a really, really important thing. But we do fundamentally, we need to make sure that the people who are doing the job are the most capable people to do the job. If there is you've got a, you feel like an endangered species sometimes, but if you're a white male and you've got somebody who's not a white male and you want to say, well, look, actually, they're even Stevens, you do let's go for the diversity option. That makes sense. If they're not even Stevens, then you've got a different issue altogether. You've got to choose the person who's best for the job, because there's a lot of ratepayers' money involved in this, not just for this council, but for up and down the country, and we need people who are going to do that job as best they possibly can, and that means the most competent people to do the job. So if you were to say to seek to improve, I think it would probably be better rather than say, here's a direction, and I'm happy with the direction you're going, but I just say we've got to make sure we get the best people for the job.
Councillor Kelby-Freeman.
Your Worship, I support both the amendment and also the suggested change by Councillor Foster. I'm not particularly exercised on which version is used. I would note that we are not calling in this for any sort of a quota. We are simply requesting the local government funding agency to improve the gender and ethnic diversity of its directors, and that's something I wholeheartedly support. We're not being dictatorial or prescriptive about exactly how that should happen or when it should happen. So I will be supporting either that, or if Councillor Fitzsimons does see clear to add the word that Councillor Foster suggests, then I would equally support that. Thank you.
Councillor Pannett.
Well, I support your amendment, Councillor Fitzsimons, and I'd request that you don't put seek to. I actually think we should put it in a firm statement. Look, I think one of the points is it's not about just the recruitment process that you go in. You actually need to start from conception about where people get privilege and advantage and access to elite circles. So I think we just need to, because once you're in a certain education, certain jobs, and then you get one job and you get another job, you're getting a lot of advantage. So I think you actually actively need to go out. Yes, people do need to be smart and have some skills, but look broadly at where those skills might have been acquired from, and it just isn't acceptable anymore to have such a balance. And I would say that we should do that across all of our boards, including the ports, which is one of the more severe offenders.
Deputy Mayor Day.
I also just want to echo Councillor Pannett's words. I would not want to see seek. I don't want to soften that. I think it's important that we get on and do this. It's really important in this day and age that we acknowledge that men and women and all different ethnic diversities have the capability of holding these roles. So we just need to make sure we get on and look for that.
Councillor Fitzsimons, right of reply.
Yeah, just very briefly, I just want to acknowledge the comments from Councillor Foster and give him an absolute assurance that it's obviously about making sure we find capable people. And I know he had a sort of covert reference to the Old Boys Club, and we are trying to break that down and get more people into these roles. As I say, if it's, as you said, if it's not even Stevens, then go for the diversity, and I think it won't be a problem. And I just note that there are lots of women and non-white people who are ratepayers as well, who can be very good candidates for these roles.
Thanks, councillors, for your debate. The recommendations of the amendment has been moved and seconded. All those in favour, please push 1. Open. And that's unanimously supported. There's no need to vote no. We'll now move to the substantive. Councillor Free.
Sorry, apologies for being out of order last time. Look, I just have had a look at the recommendations, and I guess it's in relation to recommendation 4E, which refers to approving changes to the local government funding agency's foundation policies as outlined on page 13. On page 13, I noticed there's actually 2 changes, and I am comfortable with one of them and not so comfortable with the other. The one I'm not so comfortable is lending to council-controlled organisations directly, because although that might reduce compliance costs, I think it also reduces some of the oversight that we have as a council on borrowing and the financial positions of our CCOs. So my amendment is really to seek in some way to split those. So whether that's putting the first of the changes as 4E and the second of the changes as 4F, I don't know, but I'm open to some advice as to how to achieve what I'd like to achieve.
Thank you. And you raise a point that I'll get some officer advice on. Just in order to clarify, this currently happens already through the Local Government Funding Authority.
Right.
It currently happens in that councils borrow on behalf of CCOs.
That's right.
And then pass that funding on to the CCO, but you've got a doubling in transaction and therefore costs. This wouldn't take away the requirement to have authorisation from the authorising councils, far from it. all it would allow it to do is that streamlining of that legal process, not the decision-making process, but the legal process, because you're double handling, which adds to legal costs, transaction costs, and greater inefficiency. I'll get clarification from the CFO, Andy Matthews.
The key point here is that there's two aspects where council will retain their control. The overarching of the CCO itself. The second part is the guarantee. So the way that the LGFA is structured is that the peer of the council is required to effectively guarantee it because of the way the LGFA's shareholder is structured. So because the shareholder council have to approve that. So as the council, if your CCO is going to loan directly through the LGFA, you would have to guarantee that. The council would have to agree to guarantee that, and effectively that's a right of veto.
There isn't questions. There aren't questions through the council meeting. As that was a means of clarification, I can respond in right of reply if following debate.
It's still my wish to have an amendment, please, to have those two separated out in some way so that we're voting on the first one, which is to do with the compliance, and the second one would be to do with the changes to the lending arrangements.
So you'd need to propose an amendment, Councillor
I'm proposing that
Free,
amendment.
before
I
you
don't know if I have a
sit down.
seconder, but I'm proposing that amendment, and I do have a seconder.
You'd
so-
need to. Can I suggest that we adjourn the meeting for 2 minutes while you? What I might do is allow Councillor Pannett to speak.
Yeah, because it's kind of
Noting that this amendment's been tabled, but could you please draft some words to illustrate that, and if needed, we'll adjourn to allow you to do that. But allow Councillor Pannett to speak.
So, look, thank you, Mayor and Mr Matthews, for clarifying this around the CCOs, because I'm going to be blunt here. I'm very uncomfortable because in the case of the CCO that I work for, it is wanting to expand its role. And I do not agree with this, and it's been, it is my view that CCO should be kept on a very tight leash. Now, this is the case in Wellington. In Auckland, of course, it's quite a different situation. We've got some very, very powerful CCOs. So I'm not actually that happy with it. So what I'd just like to do during if we have an adjournment, is just maybe to make a note to say that, that the council believes it is still very much important that that councils have control over what money is borrowed. And of course there is no criticism, but we have got a council officer representing us on what is a very political issue. So I think it would just be good to give the officer direction that we just need to be really careful, because some of these CCOs have got a lot of power around our country. And from my point of view, particularly with infrastructure spending, it needs democratic control must remain with the councils, and they mustn't get more powerful than the councils.
Okay, councillors, we don't have yet the amendment from Councillor Free that's been proposed, so I'll suggest we'll adjourn for 3 minutes while Councillor Free documents her amendment, and we'll reconvene. Free for the work with the officers there on bringing your amendment to the table, which now sits in front of you on your screens. I'll give you a period of time just to read the amendment, that you understand it. As you see there, it's splitting out the two changes to the foundation policy and gives councillors the opportunity to vote for each separate policy change distinctly. Councillor Kelly Freeman, you wish to speak to the amendment? Which has been seconded by Councillor Kelly. Yes, you will. I'll put Councillor Kelly Freeman. You can speak at any time. As a second.
Thank you, Your Worship. I want to thank Councillor Free for raising this issue. I have heard from our Chief Financial Officer, and I am satisfied at this point that the amendment, while it's simply a process to allow us to vote separately on two different parts of the recommendations, is not really necessary. I have listened carefully to Councillor Pannett, but I believe that Councillor Pannett is conflating authority to raise funds with a mechanism. My understanding is that the authority will still rest with councils, and that this in no way diminishes the authority of councils over their own CCOs. So I'll listen with interest to other councillors on this debate and decide at the end of it which way to vote. Thank you.
Councillor Marsh.
Thanks, Your Worship. Look, I must say I'm just slightly disappointed that we didn't have this earlier. We really should. But here we are, and it's certainly you've got the democratic right to vote on this, but I think that CFO, the Mayor and we all commented on that potential risk that could be there if Council, that's us, did not have that opportunity to say yes or no to any CCO that was looking to borrow money through this agency. We also have to have the capacity to borrow that money as a council before we can say yes. So it's not some, willy-nilly handout. This has got two safeguards built in there, and for that reason, I will not. I support the changes to the LGFA.
Councillor Calvert, you wish to speak?
Look, I'm going to support this amendment. I know, I acknowledge that it's probably come a little bit late, but I think we've also got to note that this paper is the first time it's come to council or committee. It never came through the Finance, Audit and Risk Committee, from my knowledge, which I sit on, and I would have thought it would at least come through us for that purpose. Then we could have had some of this debate. I understand Councillor Marsh talking about, well, there are two safeguards, but if we've got a couple of safeguards in place, why aren't they documented in the discussion part of the document? And we could, if this had been raised previously, it could have been included in that. Well, I don't see that. Anyway, I can't. So I think for clarity and to enable us to ensure assurance, I'm very happy to support these amendments.
I'll speak briefly. I'll cover off some of this in a response to the amendment rather than my right of reply. Look, councillors, I just want to stress how important it is for everyone to make sure they read through the entire documents before the meeting, just to ensure good governance. It is answered in the document. If you look to page 21, why would the LGFA board grant bespoke covenants to CCOs. Is there any more risk for the LGFA guarantors? No. It's clearly stated within the report there is no more risk. It does show the benefits. I just want to stress one more for clarity for everybody. I understand we've had previous discussions, often philosophical, about CCOs and their roles and their powers. This is not one of those debates. This is a transactional question and a transactional issue rather than a process one, an authorisation one, or a decision-making one. Let's keep these very clear because we want to make good decisions. Let's take a very practical example as well. Say, for example, the regional stadium, Westpac Stadium, which is a CCO, which we've all declared is the best way for it to operate as a vehicle, needs to fundraise to put, I shouldn't even put it out there, but it's in a hypothetical world, a roof on the stadium. And we all agree, because they would require our authorisation as the funding entity and as part of the CCO authorising agent to come to us for their approval. We then say, yes, that's a good idea. We then also say, they say to us, oh, by the way, we can't lend directly, you'll need to do it on our behalf. It requires more work of our officers. It requires double the transaction cost because when we loan the money from the LGFA and then pass it on, which requires doubling of the transaction costs. It's less efficient. It's more burdensome. It doesn't change the process, but the technicalities around it are just more difficult. It doesn't make any logical sense in many respects. So I want to make sure we're very clear this is a transactional decision that we are making right now, not a process one, not one around authorisation. I appreciate everyone's democratic right and their concern around it. I just want to stress the actual reality. I acknowledge Councillor Pannett's concerns around Wellington Water and the CCO. Councillor Pannett has been consistent. She's had concerns about CCOs and Wellington Water in particular. We found a really elegant solution with that. We put her on the board. Not on the board, but on the authority that has oversight power for Wellington Water, and she's doing a wonderful job of being a check and balance. But as then has access to that information, can see that it operates well as an organisation, and I think they're doing a very good job. We don't need to frighten the horses. Councillor, you've spoken, Councillor Pannett, to the amendment. You haven't spoken to the amendment. What? You're right to speak.
This is a very political issue in terms of water because the government at the moment is still considering whether to set up a whole lot of water companies, bring a whole lot of CCOs together. So I'm not given comfort, with due respect, Mayor, by what you've just said. I think, look, it's a sort of a loosening of the controls, of saying, oh, we'll just soften them up a little bit to say actually that these CCOs should have some more authority. And as it says here, you know, the lending agency will negotiate with the CCOs. I just think you're basically then relying on, you know, whoever the councillor is, maybe an official, to keep a tight eye on what they're up to. So look, I still remain concerned about the amount of power that some CCOs have in this country, and I think we just need to put a firm line in the sand. And Wellington Water and other people can speak about the CCOs that they work with, you know, has in some ways probably the most power of all of the CCOs because it provides critical service, life-saving services. So for me, it is very, very important. Water is going to be the resource that wars are fought over in the future, that we remain strict democratic controls over.
Councillor Free, right of reply.
Look, I'm not predicting how people are actually going to vote on each one of these separately. I just think it's good practice when they're clearly such different amendments that they should in fact not be considered in a lump. In fact, I'm very surprised it didn't come to us separated out so that we were able to vote on the recommendations separately. So this is all I'm setting out to initially achieve, is to give people the opportunity to consider them as separate issues and vote separately if that's what they wish to do. I have not always felt that our CCOs have been in control of that we've had good oversight over the money, and I would just give as an example the Basin Reserve. They had a pot of money there that was meant to be for some things. They've ended up delivering some other things. I just feel that we don't always have financial oversight of our CCOs. I don't see any real good reason to change what the current arrangement is and to lessen the amount of control. And compliance costs, to me, actually, they exist. And you have them there because they are part of good management and good governance. So if it's a small amount of compliance costs to enable better governance, I personally think that's a cost worth having. But my main concern with this amendment is just to give people the opportunity to endorse them separately or as a set. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Free. Now, just to clarify, as we move to vote, the recommendation, the amendment has been moved and seconded. We'll take, you'll see the one at the top, remove recommendation 4E, you'll see 6 and then 7, asking to, that we vote in favour. And we'll take A and B separately. So if you want to support A, vote for it. And if you want to support, don't want to support B, simply vote against it. That will fall away, and therefore there'll be no council approval to vote in favour of this.
Aren't we just voting, first of all, on whether we agree they should be separated out? That's all.
No, because we're not. Because if this fails, then we don't have a requirement to separate it out at their meeting. We don't want to confuse their meeting unnecessarily. If it passes, then we'll have a foreshadowed amendment which will come next, which I'm going, with the leave of the meeting, allow to be foreshadowed, that then we separate it out.
This feels a bit confusing.
No, it's logical in terms of their meeting. If we ask them, just think about this, they get to their meeting, we ask them to separate it out, but we haven't voted in favour of, if we haven't voted against the other one, if the majority are quite happy with them as they stand, let's not confuse their meeting. So we'll move, all those in favour of 6 only, please push 1. I'll take.
Doing 6 only.
No, we'll take 6 and 7A together. Yep, we'll vote on 6.
Okay, hang on, sorry, just a moment.
Would you just do it as a package? Because if they vote against that, you won't need to do these separately. You'd go back to 4E.
Yeah, true. Actually, no, we'll take it all as one. Sorry, we'll take this.
6 and 7 together.
No, we have to take it separately. We have to. Sorry.
Yeah, you're right. 6 on your own.
We'll take each separately. So 6, 7A, and 7B separately. So if you support the amendment, there's
Kane's got some advice. I think we should go 7A and B first. Because if they vote on 6, and they vote 1 year, the other.
No, we can't. No. So if you support Councillor Free's amendment, you are going to vote for all of these. If you don't support the amendment and the change, you'll vote against each of these. So we don't want to remove recommendation 4E. So sorry, if you vote, just to clarify for councillors, you'll vote. I don't want to tell you how you're going to vote. I'll just give you clarification. We'll take each separately. I'll give you each clarification on each point as we take it. If you support Councillor Free's amendment, you'll vote in favour of 6. If you do not support the amendment, you'll vote against 6. We'll start with it. Now please vote.
If you wish to have separate votes, which you'll still be able to vote for or against A and B anyway, but if you wish to make them to emphasise the fact that you would like to vote for them separately rather than as package, you would support 6.
No, you wouldn't necessarily. If you're quite happy, no. So please don't muddy the issue, Councillor Free. If you are happy with the substantive, you would vote against this. Okay, all those in favour of the change to the substantive, please vote 1.
Councillors Wolf and Young, waiting for you.
Against, now vote as well. Vote at the same time. So that has failed by 11 votes to 4. Councillor Foster may have made a mistake. Did you want to vote against it? You might have pushed one by mistake. We'll change Councillor Foster's vote. He wishes.
So this is how the votes were recorded?
Have Free and Foster got the right? We may have the wrong names. Try again. Can we try again?
We can do it again.
It could be programmed with the wrong names.
Oh, hang on. And Councillor Foster, you've got number... yes, it is programmed with the wrong names. I apologise for that.
Can you please swap?
No, I can change it. Yes.
It's only taken 5 or 6 committee meetings to ascertain that.
They vote not to move forward, then what are you going to do?
Leave the substantive.
And you just, we don't go to a separate vote,
No.
go back to
Okay. That should be good. Sorry, I'm just a little bit lost as to where I am. Close the vote. How do I get that? There we go, right. Okay.
Fortunately, councillors Free and Foster generally vote the same way. Just shows the unanimity we have often around the council table.
No, it's currently doing a thing that I don't understand. So
Okay, we'll go to hands.
hands.
All those in favour of the councillor Free amendment, in favour of the change to the substantive, just to clarify, please raise your hands. 4. We've got, yeah. I'll call you the northwest block. All those against? Okay, that has not been carried.
And folks, if you're watching this at home, just ignore the last 10 minutes.
Okay. Put the screen back up, please.
Yes.
Okay, now we'll vote on 7A. 7A is essentially the substantive, but we'll have another chance to vote on this if this passes. This is
Yes.
that would be my advice. That having voted against splitting the two, you're back to the ordinary recommendation. So you can't now move on to doing it separately.
You're right. We don't now need to move on. Okay. Thank you, Councillor Free, for your endeavours and democracy at large. Will now anyone wish to speak to the substantive? You've spoken to the substantive, Councillor Free. You can only have the opportunity to speak once. Councillor Wolfe.
Sorry, Your Worship. I'm just going to explain why I voted with the block. I think there was a process problem, and I think it should have gone through audit and risk first. And it's not the first time that this has happened in this sort of way around this table. I think that with things that are as important as this, and where we're dealing with ratepayer money that potentially, and this is actually right around the country, isn't it? Potentially. We need to be very careful, and I think that in future, we're usually aware of remits and things that go through to other annual general meetings, and I would just say that it would be prudent to at least have our audit and risk committee go over something, and Yeah, particularly as we have externals on there, and I think that that sort of advice would be welcomed. So I'm just giving you the rationale for my voting with the block.
Then Councillor Wolfe, anyone else wish to speak? Councillor Calvert-Freeman.
Your Worship, I rise simply to thank Councillor Wolfe for his contribution to that debate.
Thanks, Councillor Calvert-Freeman. I'll move to right of reply. Just simply in the right of reply, look, it's good that we have a democratic debate. I just want to clarify for all councillors, we agree our delegations at the start of the triennium. The delegations require that decisions such as this one for the LGFA come directly to council, because ultimately this is a political debate around this, not around process. If it had been around process around whether or not, for example, CCOs could loan money from the LGFA without seeking express authorisation from council, yes, absolutely, it would have had a much broader debate and had consideration and possibly even some engagement, and would have therefore gone to the Finance, Audit and Risk Committee. This isn't a debate about this. This is a transactional debate around the AGM. Let's not conflate the two around transaction and politics. The debate we've had today, rightly or wrongly, has been about politics and philosophical arguments. That wasn't the intention of the paper. We're now going to vote on the substantive. All those in favour? Oh, we're going to vote the old-fashioned way because it's not working. So please raise your hand. That's we've broken it. We didn't break the internet, but we've broken the voting machine. All those in favour, please raise your hands. Is everybody? No? Okay, that's everybody bar Councillor Free. And against? Councillor Free, wish to have a vote recorded? Yes. Thank you. The recommendations have carried. Thank you, councillors. We'll now move to report. No, we will. 3.1. We'll break for morning tea. I thought we'd be finished by then. Clearly not. We'll break for morning tea. Thank you. Councillors, we'll reconvene the meeting. Could I ask Councillor Gilbert to introduce report 3.1 on page 29?
Thank you, Your Worship. This relates to naming of reserves within the city, mainly within the Northern Ward. It's been looked at by the CSC. It's had approval there. There were some reservations expressed at that meeting, which probably reflects the shortage of bird names as much as anything else. So,
Councillor Foster.
so we do need to look after our biodiversity, just so we've got names for the reserves. But there are some great names in here, and Te Pari Ka Rangaranga, I think, is an excellent Māori name, and Ngā Kumi Kumi, which is the Māori squash or the Māori pumpkin. It's a great name, and it reflects the fact that that land was used for a mara or a garden. We also recognise local landowners and developers and people that contributed to surveying the land more than a century ago. So I support the recommendation that these names be adopted. Thank you.
Do we have a Northern Ward councillor who wishes to second? Don't all speak up at once. Councillor Day, you wish to speak? Anyone else wish to speak? Councillor Calvert.
Look, when this came to CSC, I was one of the councillors who expressed reservations, and so much so that I did vote against it, and I'm probably likely to vote against it here as well. And look, the reasons are, and I know there was a number of comments made. One comment made, I think it was by the Deputy Mayor, that, look, we shouldn't be afraid to use te reo in some of our names, and it's not about being afraid. And it's not about using Māori names or whatever names these are being promoted for. Another councillor made a comment that we were elected to make decisions. And of course we're elected to make decisions, but we are also elected to hear from various parts of our community. The naming of parks and reserves is guided by our naming policy. Now, I know this was written in 2001, and it has a strong recognition of our biculturalism, and it served us well until now, until 2018. So for 17 years, that's pretty good for a policy. So it's very simple. It's not too difficult. It's only a few pages. And yes, I think the time is right that it is reviewed. But at the moment, it's what we have. And until this year, no one really raised much of concerns about it. But, you know, things move. We have different policies. And yes, it is appropriate that we do review it. Fundamentally, my concern was we did go out to various community groups. And that's great. And those community groups gave their views and sometimes provided some background on information. And it was good because that fed into our council officers' recommendations. But given the amount of names, and I acknowledge that a lot of them are in the northern suburbs, would it not have been so difficult to actually go out to the broader community? You know, we have social media channels, we have Facebook, we have Twitter. A lot of these other community groups also have those channels through email and that. Would it not have been quite easy to have utilised those channels and go out to those local residents? I myself conducted a little Facebook poll, and I said, you know, not mentioning any particular names, but I went out and said, right, if we are naming local places, parks and reserves and that, should we just seek the views of community organisations, or should we also seek the views of community organisations and local residents? 93% votes came back and said, yes, we should seek the views of community organisations and local residents. Now, I don't pretend in any way to be a researcher or an analyst in this area, but that sort of gave me an indication that, yeah, people do think we should go out to local residents. So we haven't done it in this case. the paper itself here, I know it's been before CSC, but it doesn't actually talk about how we engaged, so there's nothing in this paper that I can refer you back to. But all I will point out that when we made that decision at CSC, we made it on the basis of the support of certain community organisations. Now, having been part of one of those community organisations, I know that they never had time to survey their member group.
Councillor
So
Calver.
it was the communities there.
Your time's up.
Thank you. Well, I think that's basically it. So that's why I can't support this going until we had a broader community engagement approach.
Thank you, Councillor Calver. Deputy Mayor Day.
I want to be able to speak on behalf of the Northern Ward, and obviously sitting in a number of meetings where these names were discussed, because many of these places are in the Northern Ward. The community were very excited about the opportunity of having these names. In fact, in Tawa, the request for this name actually came from the community. So it was very much a discussion with the community, and the Te Ngāhere o Tawa was one that came from the community. We sat in the Chewton Park Residents Association meeting when they discussed the names for the Chewton Park area, and some questions did go backwards and forwards between officers about that, but there were no concerns. So I think if there were concerns in those groups, and they generally are likely to raise concerns in those groups if there are issues, then we would have had good reason to go wider. I think when you mention social media polls that you're running yourself, you probably should mention how many people participated. I do note there were 15 votes, so it's still not a representative poll, and I think it's really important that when we're doing these things, we actually do follow the official way of doing these surveys, because it can be quite misleading. I do think it's really important the community are involved in these processes, and in this case the community was involved. Our officers worked really hard to make sure, like in Tawa for example, it wasn't just a residents association, it was the Friends of Tawa Bush, it was other groups that are very involved in the community. So I think it's really important that we do take into account that there was a good effort made to make connection and discuss those names, and sometimes in this case there were names which were significant to mana whenua, in which case it is their role to suggest a name, and it's not necessarily the role of the community to say yes or no to that name. So I feel that the names that have come up here are beautiful, they are appropriate. It's wonderful to have bird names in there that maybe we haven't seen in these places for a while, and we can be aspirational and hope that we see the kereru and the kaka and the kakariki much more in these communities. So I am excited to see names such as these put forward.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. No one else wish to speak? Councillor Foster.
Nothing's first.
Malcolm. Councillor Sparrow.
Just very briefly, I would endorse much or most of what the Deputy Mayor has just said. However, I am comfortable with most of these names. My only reservation is in terms of the Kaka Reserve, where the suggestion was made that it might be more appropriate for a part of the city where kaka were more prevalent than they are here. So on that basis, I chose to vote against it, and I probably will do the same again. Thank you.
Councillor Foster.
Thank you. Look, we had a bit of a debate about this at the Strategy Committee, and I voted against some of them. But names are long-term things. They ideally a name should be there, and it should be there in perpetuity, because it's, a generation has selected that name. Sometimes we change names, but not terribly often. So we should be selecting them with considerable care. Look, and I know we've gone through the process. We've got the Te Tauihu policy now. What we don't have yet is the implementation plan, and I note that we got an invitation for a workshop on exactly that in a couple of weeks' time. But that's after this. We also don't have the policy that Diane mentioned, the review of the naming policy, and it will bring together the naming of open spaces and streets. Again, we don't have that, but it's not that far off. So we're doing these in advance of the two pieces of policy work, which essentially should probably direct the way in which we do names. The question I've got with all these things is, do they have to be done now? Well, when we were doing street names, the answer was, and we did some street names recently through your committee, they had to be done now because people were starting getting postal addresses, and if they actually got mail, they would actually need to know where they were going to be. But these have been reserves for some time, We just haven't got around to putting a name attached to them. So I don't think the process has been particularly clever there. In terms of the names themselves, some of the names I'm quite happy with. Some of the names I'm not so impressed with because of the longevity of them. Now I know Te Taui, who is about advancing te reo and the use of te reo. I've got to say that with some of them, particularly the bird names, I think most of us actually already know those names pretty well. You might say that there would be the odd person who go, oh, I didn't know what that was the te reo name. For example, tutawai. Many people would not recognise what that is, but most of those birds, people will recognise them. So I don't think it's advancing te reo at all. My issue with those is it looks a little bit try-hard to go, oh, let's find every, as Peter said, we're not got that many birds left because we've lost too many, but let's pick a whole bunch of bird names and go and stick them down in that particular area. And by and large, it's an area in which those birds are not present at the moment. It would be great to see them present, but we've got other parts of the city where many of those birds are present. But by putting these reserved names in one part of the city, you deny the possibility they could ever go to another part of the city, which it may or may not be more appropriate. So I don't think that, in terms of if you think about the community, it's not just the community which are directly in the neighbourhood, it's the other communities who might say, actually, we would have liked that one, but we can't have it now because you've already taken it. So there is an issue in terms of process as well. Obviously, I absolutely love the birds and passionately involved in supporting them. I don't think this is a particularly clever way of reflecting that. The final thing I wanted to say is that for me, I would like to see the names tell stories a lot more. And that's whether it's the names of our open spaces or the names of our streets. They tell some of the stories of who we are, where we've come from, some of the things we've been involved in. Some of these do that, and I think it's good. Some of these do not do that, and I think we could, again, do better than we're doing at the moment. And I hope that is
Councillor Foster.
Concept. I'll just finish up then. I hope that's a concept that comes through in the naming policy. So, Mr Mayor, you've been asked to take a few of them, which are exactly the ones I voted against at committee, to take those separately, please.
Thank you, Councillor Foster. Councillor Gilbert, right of reply.
Thank you. I don't want to spend too long, but I live in Woodridge. We've planted, with council, 40,000 trees. If the birds aren't there now, they certainly will be in 10 years' time. What are the street names? What are the street names in Woodridge? Cedarwood, Silver Pine, White Pine, Pepper Tree, Tea Tree, Red Beech, Ashwood, Pigeonwood, White Pine. It's refreshing to have some Maori names. That's all I've got to say. Thank you.
The recommendations have been moved and seconded. We're going to take some separately. Just so you're aware, on page 30, reserves 1 to 3, 5 and 6 and 7. So
1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7.
As a point of process.
no, well, Councillor Sparrow would like to take Kaka Reserve separately as well, but he may wish to vote for the others, so I'm going to take as a block as best as I can. So I'm on table 1. I'll take table 1 first. So we're now voting for 4, 8 and 9. Everyone understand clearly? We're looking at table 1. We're voting for 4, 8 and 9. Reserve 4, 8 and 9. All those in favour, please vote. Oh, sorry, just 1 second.
I had to reboot it before.
Should we slip my hand? All those in favour of 4, 8 and 9, please vote.
And yourself?
Yeah.
Okay.
Councillor Lee?
He's
gone.
he's left.
Okay. It's carried. All those in favour of 1, 2, 3, 5 and 6, please vote accordingly.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
So 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 5 and 6.
Well, and I'll just blank that for a moment. And Foster and Wolf.
Foster, Wolf.
Oh, there we go.
It's carried. We'll vote in Reserve 7, Kaka Reserve. All those in favour of 7?
Here we go.
That's carried. 8-6. I will vote now for tables 2, 3, 4 and 5. All of the names in tables 2, 3, 4 and 5. I haven't had any requests to take these separately. I'm not going to do so. Please vote. That's carried. And table 6. Number of councillors to vote. Free, Fitzsimons, Kelby Freeman.
Sorry. Councillor Free.
And that's carried. So all of those names have carried. Thank you, Councillor Gilbert. We'll now move to report 3.2 on page 33, introduced by Councillor Gilbert.
Thank you very much, Your Worship. And we're talking here about the Te Porirua Harbour. And of course, it's the biggest estuary in the lower North Island. It's actually a jewel in the crown. And the problem it has is it's been filled with sediment that it's been filled with chemicals such as zinc and copper, which come from roofs and brake pads. And it's been filled with bacteria such as E. coli. So those are the issues that the harbour faces. And yet it is still a great natural wonderland and well worth a look. But in my lifetime, it's been deteriorating quite badly, and I'm afraid it's going to take another few decades to get it right. So this report outlines some of the actions, or the actions that have been taken recently, and I'd like to draw your attention to the increased investment by Porirua City Council in wastewater and stormwater infrastructure, and that's critical. We need to spend money to get these right. The strong education program that's been running, and just about every kid in every school in the catchment has been well educated on the wonders of the inlet. We're in the final stages of the whaitua process, and I hope Councillor Lee would be here to describe that. But what that's doing is it's putting some policies and some objectives around the quantity and quality of water that spills off the land into the streams and harbours. And also, there's been a good program to improve the mouth of the Porirua stream, which is near the shopping centre in Porirua, to improve that Onipoto arm of the harbour, which is really struggling. So over time, the natural recreational kaimoana values of the inlet will improve. And one thing I would like to draw your attention to is the wetland that's going to be established just below Mana College there in Elsdon. That'll start in a year's time. That's going to be really great to look at, and it will prevent flooding through the business district, which costs millions of dollars, and it will be a great asset. So that's a great initiative being supported. Wellington City Council gets off a little light, but I'm constantly, as a representative in that area, told that the Porirua stream starts in Johnsonville, goes down through Glenside Tower, Churton Park, and it is imperative that our development recognises that and we stop spilling sediment into the stream, which ends up in the Porirua Harbour. So we must get our town planning requirements right. We must have water-sensitive urban design in the new developments in that area, and it's urgent that we do it. I'd just like to finally talk about the various groups that look after the harbour. It's a bit of a talk fest in some ways, you could argue. There's a Joint Harbour Committee, which has put this forward. So that's the Joint Harbour Committee with representatives of Greater Wellington, Porirua City, Wellington City and Ngāti Toa. There's the whaitua, which will be disbanded, and that's it has representatives of the councils, but also and the iwi, but also the community. That will be disbanded. And finally, there's a number of groups, but another important one is the Porirua Harbour Catchment Community Trust, which again has representation from the various councils and Ngāti Toa. And you will be receiving a paper in due course which looks to perhaps restructure that a little bit so it really just represents the community, and the councils are represented on the Joint Harbour Committee. So just draw your attention to the fact it's quite a complicated landscape at the moment, but it will be simplified probably, and I hope those changes are for the better. And that's, yeah, thank you very much. Thank you.
Ms. Councillor Gilbert, seconded by Deputy Mayor Day.
Well, thank you very much, Your Worship, and I would like to begin by acknowledging Councillor Gilbert for his leadership in this area. It's not an easy space to work in because we're having to face some hard truths about the things that we are doing to our environment. I found the annual report really interesting to read and to see all the amazing mahi that's been going on in the community and with the community to address this very serious issue. And I'm very excited about the work that's happening in the education space and that is continuing to happen in the education space. My children have participated in the Healthy Harbours program, and it's definitely opened their eyes to the things that we do up at our house and how that impacts something that seems so far away that we can't always see from where we are. And I think it really brings home to our community that we have to face the reality of what we are doing in our community, even though it's not right next to us. That harbour feels all the water that comes through our community, particularly in heavy rain events. Tawa, particularly over the last few years, has had some, although not so much recently, some pretty significant flooding events, and it's amazing to see how fast that river goes when the rain really gets going, and it picks up all sorts of things on the way. And just to be able to walk up into Upper Stebbings Valley and see the impact that even at the beginning of one of the tributary streams that we're having to manage the fact that that water's polluted so early by some of the things happening in that space. I would also like to acknowledge the work of the Joint Committee and also for mana whenua. I know that work like this takes a lot of people's time and it is very complicated, but it's really important that it is happening. The only comment I want to make with regards to that annual report is just on page 40. It's page 41 of our document. I suspect it's page 6 of the annual report. It refers to the forest which Wellington City Council purchased last year as Spicer Forest, and I just want to clarify it's the Forest of Tāne. Spicer Forest has been in the ownership of Wellington City Council and Porirua City Council for quite some time before that. It was the Forest of Tāne which we very proudly purchased to make sure that we weren't allowing a harsh level of logging that would then impact the Porirua Harbour. So it was very much part of this ecosystem that we were considering that, and very exciting to see the reaction of the community to that purchase. So I just want to make sure that we're clear that that was the land that was purchased, and that we very much were thinking about the Porirua Harbour and the effect on the Porirua stream through that process. Thank you.
The recommendation's been moved and seconded. Moving to general debate. Councillor Pannett.
Thank you. Just very briefly, I'd just like to thank Councillor Gilbert for all his work. It obviously is a big time commitment, and of course the rest of the members. I'd like to thank you, Councillor Day, for your speech, because it is a reminder indeed that the impacts of our everyday activities do have an impact on our beautiful and precious environment. And so I hope that we will take real action on that when we come to talk about a whole lot of other projects of buildings, of motorways, that it does have an impact on our water and all the living creatures within it. It is not a good legacy to hand on to our children, which is why I've been very, on the Water Committee, not just talking about minimising the impacts on the environment, but actually leaving it better than we found it. Councillor Gilbert, always of course happy to talk to you about what we need to do to really fulfil our part. Of course we've got a whole lot of other water issues around the city, but of course this is very important to your part of the city. So thank you again, and I hope this will open people's eyes about the impacts of their daily lives on the environment.
Councillor Foster.
Yeah, look, I'm pleased to see this report as well. A few comments that I wanted to make. First one of them is that obviously we've seen the government in the last couple of weeks announce some policy initiatives that with the clear intention of cleaning up our, particularly the freshwater part, but it's obviously the freshwater leads to the saltwater, and I think I welcome that. We have not looked after the waterways of this country for a long time. We've done a very, very poor job in that, as we have done in much of our environmental management, and we have to do a lot better. Because it is not our environment. It's an environment that we are the current guardians of, and that we will pass on to others. And of course, there are other creatures which live on this planet other than just us, so they might feel they have some claim to the space as well. Look, I think there's some great progress that's being made here. There's obviously a lot more to do. It is really pleasing that it's not just the infrastructure part's great, but it's also great that the children are being involved in this as well, because I think if our generation hasn't got it quite right, we're starting to try more and more, but future generations are going to be the ones who have to pick up the pieces, and that's going to be a big challenge. This is coming to Wellington and the Hutt Valley very, very soon as well. Of course, we've got the Whaitua work and really looking forward to that. We know that I think just about every one of our streams in the city fails in terms of the water quality, so we have to do things differently. That is our land use, our development, protection of and increase of vegetation along stream sides. There's a whole lot of things we need to do. Interesting having a conversation the other day at a residents' meeting where somebody who'd been doing a lot of work on this in this case it was the Karori stream, saying, you know, he started off saying, I thought this was council's problem. And he ended up saying, actually, it's not council's problem alone. It's all of our problem. Because it's the way we do what we do in terms of our lifestyle, what we tip down drains, but it's also the way in which our own pipes, etc., you know, personal ones are connected to each other. So there are problems which we've all got to face. So we're all part of the problem. We've all got to be part of the solution, and I'm sure that we can be that part of the solution. So, yeah, pleased to see this progress. Pleased to see government in behind it as well. And I look forward to further progress on this Whaitua and also on the Whaitua work that's coming up for the Hutt and for Wellington City.
Councillor Kilby-Freeman.
Thank you, Your Worship. Look, I commend the process, the leadership shown by our council colleagues and the report itself. I wonder whether it would be possible to ask that an addendum or errata be put to the report just clarifying these Baisa Forest issues so that it reads Tūnaheri o Tawa, or whether the online version could be changed with the agreement of the report's authors. And I asked Councillor Gilbert whether that could be passed back to the committee, please.
Councillor Gilbert, right to reply.
Thank you, Your Worship, and thank you for the comments around the table. I'll look at that particular issue, Councillor.
The recommendation's been moved and seconded. All those in favour, you can vote now. That's been carried unanimously. Thank you, councillors. We're now going to move into public excluded.